to next door to compete with, so we'll try and speak up, I guess. We're here to talk about this report, launched a couple of weeks ago by Wetlands International, discussing wetlands and human migration in the Sahel. Topics that perhaps haven't been put together very much, and that really is the purpose of the report. Is that microphone working okay? I seem to be going on and off. It's all right. We have a panel here, as you'll see, from International Organization of Migration, Red Cross and DevCo, and Jane from CEO of Wetlands International. We're going to each give a short presentation, and I'm going to begin, though I'm technically the moderator, I'm going to begin just to introduce the report to you. I was one of the authors of the report. It's a story of how large dams and often ill-founded hydrological development schemes in the Sahel have helped strengthen the mass migration that we've seen in the last couple of years from the region to Europe and elsewhere. And the argument behind it is very simple, that these projects may be aimed at harnessing water for development, but have actually been drying out key water resources, the wetlands of the Sahel, the sources of life and livelihoods for millions of people in the region. Most obviously, the desiccating of the Lake Chad has been a major issue, but also the Indonesia Delta in Mali, the Senegal River floodplain, and some other places we've been looking at in some detail. And this degradation of the wetlands has been causing social breakdown, law and order breakdown, and in some cases, a mass exodus as livelihoods are lost. And that's the core of the report. It's largely, I think, an untold story, partly because dried up wetlands are routinely and often incorrectly blamed on climate change, when frequently it's human interference in the hydrology of a region rather than climate change, which is to blame for wetlands drying out. Partly also because development agencies mostly still think of dams as infrastructure development, sometimes harmful in nature to admittedly, a bit of collateral damage, but furthering economic activity and wealth overall, that's the presumption. And finally, because many environment groups only talk about the ecological impacts of dried up wetlands, and they will tend to ignore the human consequences. So this has kind of got left out, I think, of debates where it should be central. The truth is that in the Sahel wetlands, we support tens of millions of people. Wetlands are the main sources of the region's productivity, especially outside the short wet season, where they're the only places where you can grow crops and take livestock. They provide fisheries, provide wildlife, water supplies for people and livestock, wet ground for growing crops, pastures that are, as I say, vital during the dry seasons and also when the rains fail. So they sustain large numbers of people, and they should be nurtured, treated as kind of collateral damage in development projects. We often talk about drought in the Sahel in the context of meteorology. Rainfall is the problem, but actually in much of the region, rainfall has largely recovered since the great droughts of the 1970s to the 1980s that I certainly remember well. The problem now is not really bad meteorology, it's bad hydrological engineering. So in writing the report, I took a number of journeys, but I journeyed through the valley of the River Senegal, which forms the border between Senegal and Mauritania, and I met farmers and herders and fishers battling against this ecological breakdown that has followed the re-engineering of the river, particularly the Manantali Dam upstream in Mali. One teacher in one village told me, compared to the past, there aren't many fish. Our grandparents did a lot of fishing, but we don't. And he was, among many people, he was very clear about why. He said in the past, the river had a flood that watered the wetlands where the fish grew. Now there is no flood because of the dam. People there see very clearly what's been going on, what their problem is. And he said hundreds of people had left his village and the villages around. And they were heading for Dhaka, the capital, but many were also coming to Europe. So the dam has undoubtedly benefited many people on irrigation projects, people in cities get the hydroelectricity, but it's caused on that river the loss of 90% of its fisheries. It's dried up 250,000 hectares of seasonally flooded land where farmers could once plant crops and where forests and wildlife flourished. And that's just one area. All across the Sahel, similar wetlands are becoming smaller, less biologically diverse, but also less productive for humans. Take the Indonesia Delta in northern Mali, the largest floodplain still in West Africa. The Delta is today one of the most productive areas in one of the poorest countries, that is Mali. Even at its largest, the Delta covers just 1.6% of Mali, but it provides pasture for 30% of the country's cattle. It delivers 8% of the country's GDP and sustains 2 million people, 14% of the population. Water abstractions upstream have already cut the area of the Delta that's flooded each year, causing declines in forests and fisheries and grazing grasses. People are leaving. Journalists increasingly talk about people from Mali and the Indonesia Delta being on those boats heading from Libya to Italy. And there may be more to come. Now Mali's upstream neighbor Guinea plans to construct the Fomi hydro dam, which will deliver hydroelectricity, but will be really bad news for the wetland. And Mali itself wants to triple the irrigated area upstream of the wetlands, another major threat. These schemes, according to some analyses, could cut fish catches and pastures in the Delta by 30%. And that could lead to hundreds of thousands of people being displaced, moving on, who knows where. And to find out what that could mean, go just east to Lake Chad, which has lost more than 90% of its surface area, the lake, since the early 1970s. Initially, that was certainly down to meteorological drought, but there's been a general rise in rainfall in that area, in its catchment area, in the last 15 years, whereas the lake remains stubbornly empty. The reason, again, is water abstractions upstream, principally on the Lagone River in Cameroon. Dams like the Mega Dam, or principally the Mega Dam, have been good for irrigating rice farms, but have destroyed the river's floodplain pastures, dramatically also reduced the size of the Lake Chad, with regional scale consequences. The dislocation of people is driving social breakdown and conflict all around the lake. You read the West African media, you'll hear all about this, culminating, many say, in the growing power and tyranny of Boko Haram. We're talking about ecological causes of profound social breakdown. As one official of the Lake Chad Basin Commission put it a couple of years ago, youths in the Lake Chad Basin are joining Boko Haram because of a lack of jobs and difficult economic conditions resulting from the drying up of the lake. And the result of the chaos and desiccation is now becoming mass exodus. As the UN humanitarian coordinator of the Sahel region put it, asylum seeking, the refugee crisis, the environmental crisis, the instability that extremists sow, all of these issues converge in the Lake Chad Basin. It's a kind of nexus in which environmental decay, wetland decay is central. Now, the links in the chain from water management through wetland health to migration are clearly complex, more complex than I've allowed for here, I'm sure. And we don't claim in the report that wetland loss is the only reason for outward migration. It's a more complex process, of course. And we certainly accept that migration is a long-standing coping strategy for people living in a region of extreme climate variability. Migration is good as a coping strategy. It's bad when it's simply evacuating an area because it can no longer sustain people. By drying out the wetlands of the Sahel, we're damaging the livelihoods and resilience of some of the most marginalized communities on the continent. This is not, as some imagine, just collateral damage in the drive for development. It fatally undermines livelihoods and chokes off development, results in massive outmigration that is in nobody's interests. We're talking here in Europe, but we're also talking principally about the interests of African nations and the communities living in these wetlands. That's the essence of the report. We're going to discuss the issues raised in more detail now, and we have more people coming in, which is good, and I hope we're going to have a conversation in the last half hour involving you as well. But I'm going to pass over first to Jane Madrick, the CEO of Wetlands International, to talk more generally about rehabilitation of wetlands and resilience strategies, how to make wetlands more resilient, not less resilient. Jane.
Okay, thank you, Fred, for that passionate introduction. You can see why I reached out to Fred Pearce to help put this report together. I want to tell you a little bit about why Wetlands International would take the step to develop this report, which is essentially about causes of human migration. So Wetlands International is a global NGO. We're a network organization, and I'm here representing my colleagues who work across the Africa region and principally in the Sahel. So we're not a European-based NGO just commenting on what's going on in Africa. What is evidenced in the report is born of our own experience and the experience of our partners over the last 2 decades. And why put this report together? I think, honestly, it was in frustration of reading about how climate change is really the only real environmental driver in the Sahel that is causing water scarcity, which has consequences for human livelihoods. The whole issue of the last decades of poor water management in the region and the impact of that through ecosystems on people seem to be being missed in the whole resilience dialogue. And as I said, born of our own experience working in some of these areas over several decades, we had witnessed the mass exodus from the floodplain systems across the region in years where the rainfall was low, but not actually a drought. And we understood that this was happening because of excessive water diversions upstream of where most of the people were living. And we witnessed firsthand the impact on local populations who we were trying to support to have a more resilient, diverse options for living in, for example, the Indonesia Delta. So these were the real motivations, and also it was part of an evolution of our work. We first went to these major wetland systems in the Sahel because of their value actually to nature, to water birds. So the water birds from Europe, tens of millions actually spend the winter in these wetlands. So 25 years ago, that's what took us there. But very quickly, we started to work with the local communities and understand how close, how intimate their relationship was with the natural resources of these areas, and to work with them and enable them to restore the ecosystems as a means to restore and diversify their own livelihoods. And this helped us to gain connection with development organizations as well as the government and private sector. And in the last 8 years, also with humanitarian organizations like Red Cross and CARE, who work across the Sahel, connecting together the issues, enabling communities to take action to, at the same time, restore ecosystems, as to build their resilience to an ever insecure climate, and to prevent water shocks from happening in some cases. But it led us from working at the small scale community level to try to understand what was going on in the landscape. And this, through a lot of good science, enabled us to paint the scenarios of what the future could look like if the water was managed differently in some of these basins, and to share that knowledge with the communities and with the different agencies and ministries and river basin organizations. And in turn, this has in some areas enabled us to get a pause in the development strategy and a rethinking about how development could be actually based on these ecosystems, which are at the moment central to the local economy. And this is all against a backdrop of the global recognition that degradation of the environment is a driver of water risk, is a driver of displacement. But we didn't see this translating into investments across the Sahel, into, for example, rethinking the water management to sustain the ecosystems which are the most productive area of the Sahel, on which not only the people who live in the wetlands depend, but also those who come in their millions from the dry lands in the dry season, also depending on this area, which is approximately 10% of the whole of the Sahel. We were not seeing this translated into development investments in any significant way. And when we look at the global goals for 2030, we see that actually by sustaining and restoring these floodplain systems in the Sahel, one of the most fragile regions, actually a whole bundle of the Sustainable Development Goals could be reached. So through water and the regulating function of wetlands in this region, we can make some steps towards ending hunger and to providing water for all and to reducing water risks, as well as to tackling land degradation and sustaining and restoring ecosystems. So we are working across the Sahel to encourage the governments to recognize that these floodplain systems are in fact infrastructure, that they are the basis for development. They are part of what's now called critical infrastructure. That means they are essential for the functioning of society and economy. But unfortunately, they're not present on the key maps and inventories. They're not present in the key dialogues to a sufficient extent. So this is work to be done. And we see that it lines up very nicely with the EU policy frameworks, the focus on resilience, the need for development across the region. So we call for two things, essentially, in this report. The first is, of course, risk-informed development, understanding the risks of infrastructure schemes, how that would be likely to affect downstream productivity, lives and livelihoods, based on mapping these risks across the landscape. And there are methods to do this that are tried and tested. In saying this, it's not enough to limit environmental degradation, to limit it further. This is simply not enough when these floodplain systems have already shrunk to a fraction of their former size. So to enable real resilience long-term across the Sahel, large-scale ecosystem restoration will be needed. And at the center of that, a rethinking of how to manage the water across this landscape. So it is of great concern to learn that not many of the countries across this region are actually flagging up a need for technical support and development support in the field of water management. They are flagging it up in terms of food and energy, but the critical component of water, central to those needs, is missing in those asks. What we see as the real need is to overcome sectorial silos, which are really an obstacle in every country, in every river basin across this region, to getting really a holistic picture of what kind of water management and ecosystem management is needed to bring about resilience. And I just came back from Cancun, the Global Forum on Disaster Risk Reduction, and indeed this was the main topic of conversation in the Ministerial Roundtable. Ways and means to bring different ministries together across whole landscapes, across whole basins, as well as in countries, to bring these different sectors to work towards a common, more sustainable future scenario. So we see lots of opportunity through existing pledges for development and climate assistance in the Sahel. And we don't see anywhere that should be a higher priority in the world to give a focus within that on wetlands as a source of resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. You talk about rethinking water management. Can dams be a help in that, or are dams always bad, or can we remanage or manage dams in a different way to actually increase rather than reduce resilience?
Yes, this is, of course, an important question. If we're talking about the Sahel region specifically, then there already are many dams. What is a priority for some of those major dams is to look at the operation of them. In most cases, it's not well regulated. It's definitely not linked to downstream impacts and the beneficiaries downstream in any systematic way. So rethinking the operationalization of those dams to give a seasonal flow to these floodplains is top priority. And in this particular situation, new dams need to be looked at with very, very close scrutiny. So it's not to say it's never a good idea, but they really need to be closely scrutinized because of the impact on seasonal flow and because of that direct proportional impact on production downstream.
Thanks. And you can re-engineer existing dams. I mean, if you've got an existing dam, you can.
It's absolutely possible, being done in many places. And in the Upper Niger Basin, we're looking forward to providing exactly the right technical advice that would allow that to happen.
Okay, great. Let's move on. Next, we're going to hear from Felice Zaccheo from DEFCO, the head of Sustainable Energy and Climate Change. I think I had that right. Talking about investment in the natural infrastructure we've been talking about, how nature can be infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Fred. Thanks. Is on? Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me again. I think it's not the first time that I have the pleasure to be with Wetlands International. We hosted also an event at our premises in DEFCO. And I think it's very, very, very timely report and publication was shown. And I would say that from what you say and what you say, I think we can agree on most of the conclusion, and in particular the need for strengthening socio-ecological knowledge base and institutional capacity in the countries and in the basin authority. But capacity, I think, is not the only factor. I mean, I will tell you later how do we have the our strategy of fostering the investment on energy that can be applied for natural infrastructure. So there is a pillar of cooperation activities that will be done. Policy reform is one of that. It's very important, and we say, and investment. I mean, the ones of you that have been here since this morning, I think investment has been the word. We are, as European Commission, preparing a massive investment plan that is going to have as one of its pillars really an investment windows that can tackle the different aspects: climate change, energy, dealing with all the different aspects, agriculture. But investments are at different level. And investment needs investments in this case are also needed to scale up community-based approaches to safeguarding and restoring wetland ecosystem. And this is a role that the civil society can play very, very well, because they have the capacity to unite the different ethnic groups. They have the capacity, as they are based locally, they can prevent and reduce conflict, and of course they can be of a great help in fighting the illegal. Not only that, but they can contribute, and this is very important. But investment are also say taking into account other aspects. And for instance, when we talk about support to national infrastructure, we have to create an environment. We have to create new partnerships that have to identify opportunity to invest. They have to create investment opportunity that can leverage source of financing. And of course, as I said before, the reform of the policy, the creation of a conducive environment for investment is essential. And in this, I mean, everybody plays a role. the governments, they play a role, and the industry, the private sector, the civil society, they all play a role, because this aspect have to be embedded into the investment aspect has to be embedded in the natural infrastructure as a core strategy to address the food, the water, and energy security. And you have to diversify this type of investment. Another challenge that we have, and this has been the last couple of years with the Paris Agreement, the creation, establishment of the SDGs, the Sendai framework, all this have been pointed, the need for international approaches, integrated approaches to land, water, and ecosystem. And this is what we do in DEFCO, in the European Commission. We are trying to find these interlinkages. This, you said, we try to break the sectoral silos, because we want to, let's say, want to find connection, synergy between key priority for development, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. First of all, I think when we are striving in making our development cooperation program, we have tried to find climate smart solution to mainstreaming. You have to know that 20% of our budget, our development budget, but our whole EU budget is climate action oriented, targeted climate action. And this is very important. This is something, that I'm sure we could do better, we could increase, but this is something that we are really looking at very carefully. We support our partner countries in mainstreaming climate change into their national policy and plans, including the support of the national development contribution and also the Sendai framework. We have launched this morning the European Consensus on Development. The European Consensus on Development, if you look at it, is a cluster-based approach, where again it goes into trying to find, the importance of the cross-sector operation, identifying key sectors that can help, investment that can help development. We talk about the role of sustainable energy. We talk about the role of climate change, resilience, healthy ecosystem, improved access into to finance and innovation, job creation, looking at some aspects like gender and youth and gender empowerment in a cross-cutting way. So I can give, before I will tell you a little bit more on what we do on boosting investment on energy in Africa. I give you an example of what I would define flagship initiatives. That is the Global Climate Change Alliance Plus. That is it's one, I think, of the largest climate initiatives that we have, where we exactly work a lot in the region, in the area. We have programs in Mauritania, in Gambia, in Niger, in Benin, in Chad, in Senegal. We're talking about mitigation, adaptation, resilience, establishment of capacity funds. We have 60, since the starting, we have 60 projects in 38 countries. We have invested, first, when we started the Global Climate Change Alliance, so we invested 285 million for a period 2008-2013, and now we are investing additional 420 million for the period 2014-2020. And this is mostly concentrating on LDC, on small on seeds, on small island states, and on community-based initiatives. So it's exactly the tool that we could use to have the issue. Now, when we talk, and this is, I think, we have to be proud of it, when we talk about the investment on sustainable energy, sustainable energy that can that we have, I think this is something that's it's if we look at the challenges that we have globally, I think may not make a difference, but we have a substantial amount of funding. We have 3.7 billion of euro for the period 2014-2020, and 2 out of 7 billion euro are only for Africa, for sub-Saharan Africa. And with this, we want to we are perfectly in line with Sustainable Development Goal, with because we aim at providing access to energy to about 40 million people, contributing to it, to help the generation of renewable energy up to 5 gigawatts in this period, and to reduce in the fight against the climate change, to reduce the production of up to 50 million production of CO2 emission per year. How do we do that? This is something, as I say, that is really something that is now embedded. If you look at the consensus for development, if you look at all our policy documents, energy is really the driving, a key driver for development, for the job creation, for the fight against migration, and it can help, situations that are linked also to wetlands area. We do it basically, as I said at the beginning, in 3 ways. We have what we call it a 3 pillars approach. And this is the same 3 pillar approach that we are going also to pursue in the external investment plan. We have, first of all, have a political dialogue with our partner countries. And this is, we do it. We have 30 countries that have selected globally, and most of them in Africa, energy as a focus sector for our bilateral cooperation, and some of them are in the Sahel region. We basically engage because we have our delegation, our colleagues that works in the countries to establish this policy dialogue and to commit the governments to reforms that then can create conducive environment that can stimulate investment. We have signed 23 joint declarations. One more will be signed tomorrow with the Republic of Guinea. Can I
ask you to wind up in a minute?
Yes, and that's very important. We have policy dialogue at all levels. With the African Union, with the budget, we have policy dialogue with the new African initiative like Array, and tomorrow there is a panel on the African renewable energies that I will invite you all to come and to see, to participate at 11 o'clock. I'm doing something. I said with our Commissioner Mimica, with the President Condé, and then I say policy reform. Policy reform. Then, in this particular, in most of the countries, it cannot happen without capacity building, and we also have this with our technical assistance. We have, but once you have all this and the condition that you need to create innovative mechanisms for financing, and this is why we are developing, different tools that mix loans and grants that we provide in order to stimulate the intervention of new alternative action, because I talked about 3.7 billion euros that are available. This 3.7 billion euros of the ODA assistance will not make, to fight the challenge that we have. We need to leverage it. We need to have the private sector also involved, not only the traditional civil society, and we need to involve them to invest in situations where otherwise they would not go. It's easy to go to Kenya, it's easy to go to Morocco, it's easy, but we need to take them to the situation where otherwise we will not go, and we need to take them to the remote areas where the on-grid will not arrive. They say it may never arrive. So I stop here.
Thank you. Okay, that's great. Thank you. It's really interesting. We're going to move on now to Eugenio Ambrosi, who is from the International Organization for Migration, the European Economic Area Director, I think I'm right to say, to talk more about migration. I don't know, good migration, bad migration, opportunities for adaptation to ecosystems, for resilience in ecosystems provided by migration. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody. As you just said, I come more from the migration mobility angle than the environmental and climate change type of activities. But there are a few points that I think are very relevant to this discussion, because as it is said also in the agenda, of course, migration is a phenomenon that is caused by a variety of situations, of which environment, changing environment and degradation is one. It's very difficult to precisely separate which cause is more important. But of course, there are specific situations where we can see the predominance of one cause over the other. And I guess the migration from the Sahel is a good example where environmental degradation has a major impact on mobility both within the region and outside the specific sub-region. In fact, as we have watched over recent years, the change in migration patterns within the Sahel region and West Africa region as a whole, which traditionally has used migration as a livelihood strategy, as many other regions of the world have done. As we have seen the disruption of this normal historical cultural pattern of migration, we have also seen at the same time a major increase in arrival in Europe from this very region. And so, is it a coincidence? Or it is actually a direct cause of such disruption caused by environmental degradation? I think is a question that we might not be able to answer completely and satisfactorily, but my personal guess is that there is a direct link, of course, as I don't believe too much in coincidence. You mentioned migration could be good or could be bad. Of course, migration is at the same time caused by environmental degradation, but in some situation and in some specific cases, migration has been also the cause of environmental degradation. If we just think about some of the countries in Africa, not specifically or not only in this region that we are discussing, but in other parts of Africa, where you have seen large congregation of refugees for a prolonged period of time, large refugee camps or other large refugee settlement, you see almost immediately a very fast degradation of the overall environment surrounding those settlements because of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of proper management of this type of situation. I was many years ago now, in '94 in Rwanda during the genocide, and the environmental and the deforestation of area of eastern Zaire at the time, where large number of Rwandese refugees were present, it was visible almost on a daily basis. So migration is at the same time caused by environmental degradation, but also can be the cause of environmental degradation, which calls for the need that we advocate continuously of properly managing and properly governing the migratory flows and the migratory phenomenon in general. Now, what does it mean in this specific case? And here I would like to make a couple of overall comments and reflection that also originates from the report that has been presented. First of all, when we talk about how migration is impacted by environment, or how much it impacts environments and the impact of water shocks on migration, etc., we are talking about a set of policy areas that for many, many years have been treated separately, each in its own right, and looked at in a sort of silo approach. That has caused, I think, a lack of coherence in our overall intervention from a development point of view, from a policy point of view in other areas, because the interlinkages between what we were doing on environmental management, what we were doing on population and mobility management, the interlinkages were not looked at, were not considered, and sometimes you might have created a conflict between those two policy areas or several policy areas. This calls, I think, for an effort to start rethinking also the way we approach development in general, how we approach migration within the development strategy and the SDGs that have a large portion and many reference to migration as a development factor, and how we manage to ensure coherence between different policy areas that have an impact on each other. And this is something that maybe we haven't paid enough attention to until now. The other consideration that I think is very relevant is that migration carries with it the concept of borders, either because we don't want borders or because they exist and we have to respect them. Water shock or environmental degradation have the tendency of not caring that much about borders. So whatever you might do in a certain place has an impact somewhere else across a national border. This means that the need to ensure that the action and the policy we devise, or the policy and then the action as a result of the policy that we devise, work across countries and in certain situations across region is, in my view, essential if we want to be effective and if we want to be efficient in bringing about changes that have a positive effect on livelihood of communities. So coordinated regional or sub-regional approach, I think, is a priority and is one of the conclusions I would draw from the report that we are looking at. While at the same time, you need to ensure that local communities and local actors are involved because they know, when I think you were mentioning in your opening remarks, they know what is happening in their environment and what impacts it has on their own daily livelihood, positive or negative. So the ability of bringing together these two aspects, a regional coordinated approach with proper relevance given to local community, I think is strategically important. And the last element that I would like to mention, which goes to some extent along the line of the policy coherence I was mentioning before, is how do we devise, especially in Europe these days, proper migration policy? And what are the migration policy that we are looking at right now, and what does it mean for other regions of the world? And I'll use one example. The top priority in Europe right now, when it comes to migration, or one of the top priority is return. We are receiving a larger number of migrants and refugees than before. And what we are saying is, okay, some of those people fit the 51 Refugee Convention criteria, so they have the right to stay. Those who don't fit this criteria have to return home. This is perfectly legal and perfectly logical. What happens is that the vast majority of those that don't fit the 51 Convention criteria happen to come from the country that have been examined in your report and that are suffering from these water shocks. Do we consider enough? What does it mean to return large number of people? Because we're talking about several thousand, tens of thousands of returnees. But that this policy decision taken here in Europe, perfectly legal, will have on the situation that we are examining in terms of water shock in the Sahel. Because you will have large number of people going back to Niger, going back to Senegal, going back to Chad. We making the situation worse by doing something perfectly legal and perfectly logical that serves our purpose, but impacts negatively another region? Is there a way that we can use this returning flow to actually tackle some of these problems? I think these are questions that we should ask ourselves, both operators as policymakers, are also questions we haven't asked ourselves enough. And it's probably one of the challenges that I would bring back home from reading this report and listening to the presentation today, because I think this is potentially one of either the most important step forward we can have in trying to manage the water shocks we're talking about, or potentially one of the most disastrous impact that we can make by using a legal policy logical for us and dangerous for other regions of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. European leaders have been talking a lot about the last couple of years about tackling the root causes of migration in the context of the Sahel. Is it your sense that there is an awareness or an understanding that environmental degradation is a root cause, or has that sort of not got into the policy agenda yet?
I think it's not got into the policy agenda enough. Yes, there is a recognition of environment and environmental degradation being one of the causes. However, I have the impression that priority is given to a variety of other aspects. And what is potentially worrying is, again, what I was saying at the beginning, all the other aspects, poverty reduction and unemployment, etc., are all obviously important issues to tackle. But what is worrying is whether we are looking at how to tackle this issue in conjunction with how do we preserve the environment that we need to preserve in order to then have also sustainability to any poverty reduction or job employment type of intervention, because you can be very effective in creating 10,000 jobs somewhere if then all these people have to run away because of environmental impacts. You haven't really solved the problem. So I think there is the need to push more on that specific subject.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, final panelist is Raymond Dysons, if I pronounced that right?
Very correct.
Global Coordinator for Partners for Resilience, and at the Netherlands Red Cross and Partners for Resilience. Among its partners are the Red Cross and Wetlands International, but I'm sure Raymond will tell us more, talking about building societal resilience as a component of ecological resilience, I guess.
Thank you, Fred. And thank you for the invitation. I'd like to highlight why the Red Cross is teaming up with organizations like Wetlands International, and why we feel that working in partnerships is vital to address the issues that we discuss here. The reasons why proper management of wetlands matters, I think it's clear what you described. Environmental degradation undermines vital functions that people rely on, makes people more vulnerable, and that is by default a concern for humanitarian organizations like the Red Cross. And the migration patterns that emerge contribute to social conflicts, to increasing economic inequalities between people who leave and people who stay behind, and even to migration to notoriously unstable and insecure countries, and consequently to Europe, as was just explained. And as far as the latter is concerned, the Red Cross is not in the business to prevent migration, but we are in the business to prevent and reduce human suffering. And what we see here, like in many other places, is that vulnerability is increasing, and consequently that the need for humanitarian support is increasing. And this fits the trend that our relief budgets are stretched, and it underlines the need to work more on prevention and mitigation of disasters to complement our life-saving work. It requires us to work with organizations that have expertise in the longer-term trends, in the underlying causes that we need to understand before we can meaningfully reduce disaster risks. And that is why several years ago already, the Netherlands Red Cross teamed up with Wetlands International, but also with CARE Netherlands, Coordinate Red Cross Climate Center, to form Partners for Resilience. Partners for Resilience, in that partnership, we bundle our expertise coming from different fields to work together to increase community resilience in helping people to better cope with shocks and stresses, and strengthening people to be more active themselves rather than waiting for outside support. Partners for Resilience is a multi-partner, multidisciplinary partnership. We work at the overlap of humanitarian and development domains. And those are the domains where the shocks and stresses are not only chronic, but in many cases also deepen. We managed to form a successful partnership. Apart from the great people that we work with, it's of course that the key success is that the integrated risk management approach that we have developed and applied. We combine and make maximum use of the different expertise and experience of different partners. Now, this IRM, Integrated Risk Management, contains some elements that feature also prominently in the Sahel study that Piers introduced. It regards disaster risks by looking at longer time scales, factoring in the impact of climate variability, climate change on current and future risks. It regards risks by looking at wider spatial scales, applying a landscape approach, because the places where risks originate may be far away from the places where they become manifest, and even can be on different sides of the border, as just was explained. It regards the role of ecosystems, both as a buffer against disaster risk, but also as a sort of livelihood for communities. And it looks how to link local realities with global policy frameworks, as was mentioned earlier, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Climate Agreement. But most of all, it takes a community approach. It works to strengthen communities to understand the risks they face and to take measures that help them to better deal with it. Measures to be ready to act if disaster strikes, but also measures that help to reduce the impact or even prevent disasters from happening. And measures to strengthen livelihoods so people have more and stronger means to cope with shocks and stresses. Part of the approach is also to organize them, the communities, as civil society organizations, so that they can express their needs and concern and propose and discuss possible ways to address these. Not necessarily as opposing forces, but as partners in dialogues. And a case in point is our experience in Kenya. It's about communities living along the Ngiru River that runs from Mount Kenya through the central part of the country to the Lorient swamps that were also mentioned in the study. And the overuse of water there, especially upstream, results in longer dry periods when water doesn't reach the swamp and affects the people who rely on it. And deforestation, which when it rains contributes to flash floods. So people downstream are confronted with both floods and droughts. And Partners Brazilians help them in two ways. First, we support measures that help them to better deal with too little or too much water. That includes measures like constructing small ponds in which they can catch water and grow mudfish, installing irrigation schemes and giving access to more drought-tolerant seeds for dry periods, better storing of fodder for cattle, more economic schemes to sell off their livestock in time, plus early warning systems and contingency plans in case of imminent floods. We also help them to establish the Waso River Users Empowerment Platform that unites affected communities along the river from upstream and downstream. And at the picture behind me, you see them march in a camel caravan where communities downstream travel upstream and communities upstream travel downstream, and they met in the middle, attracting a lot of media attention and meeting there with government, local authorities and private sector. And they were able to explain their situation, express their concerns and their needs. And as a consequence, they are now a respected partner in discussion on water management along the river, including the construction of a proposed dam. Now, I believe that is an example of the way forward in the Sahel, helping communities to become better able to deal with water shocks and at the same time address the root causes. And the joining of organizations with different backgrounds, expertise, mandates, like the Red Cross and Wetlands International, I think is a crucial factor to do that effectively. And we hope, and we certainly work hard to ensure that our approach will be taken up wider. I believe that the situation described in the report. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. No, well, I was thinking of asking a question, but I won't. I'm going to move to the audience because we're past 7 o'clock. Questions for any or all of the panelists? I don't think we have a microphone to pass around. Oh, we do. Sorry, there's one behind. So, you said?
Hi, I'm Philippe Perrault from Wageningen University, and I work on the water, energy, food, ecosystem, something else nexus now, I'd say. Really thank you for your discussion, for all of you. It is very interesting. You talk about ecosystems, and there is a concept that I did not hear, is ecosystem services. intellectually speaking, is super weak. I'm an academic. However, it's a fantastic tool to discuss with local communities, from the farmers to the ministers also, to help understanding the functioning of critical or green infrastructure where we rely upon, and helping also to frame priorities. They don't have much means. We bring some of the means and some of the help. We can also bring some strategies, but there is a consensus building that is very important when managing a country and this without border crisis. And I wonder if this concept is used to have an integrated approach across your policies or impacts.
Thanks, that's a great question. Yes, Wetlands International works very much with the concept of ecosystem services. I think the reason why we've been able to get the ear of some ministers and to start policy dialogues in some of these basins is because we give them numbers. We talk about the productivity of the wetlands and the comparison with between, for example, the floodplain wetlands and the irrigated rice. You know, sometimes it's a factor of 10 times more productive in the floodplain. And we have worked quite hard in some of these river basins to get these numbers together. Also, to show the different distribution of benefits across society with different hydrological scenarios, so with different water management. So yes, I believe that's absolutely critical to getting listened to. And although these are beautifully diverse natural areas, we almost never use biodiversity as an argument, because this is really about survival in these floodplain areas.
Felice, it was something I was thinking of asking you earlier. Is this an issue of how to quantify benefits? I mean, it's all very well to say that we want to invest development money in natural infrastructure, but people who are putting money in want a fairly clear idea of what they're going to get out, and I can imagine that's often quite hard. Is that an issue for you, just being able to quantify what you can deliver if you're investing in a natural ecosystem?
Thank you very much. This is a burning question. Quantify is very challenging, because this is, I think, the biggest challenge that we have in our, if we talk about energy, if you talk about any sector, about the natural infrastructure, because we can estimate. If I look at the figures that I gave you are the 30 million for energy access, the 40 million for energy access, the 6.5 gigawatt, the tons of CO2 that are saved. This is based, on estimation of what the situation is under certain conditions. Then you have to go into the reality of the situation. You have then to make you have to go and convince the partners, the river to invest. So it's very challenging, and this, I think, is the next big. We have now all the policy set. We have all the implementation, the action. Now we have to take you have to account. You have to see what is done, and this is exactly what the community, together with the partners, are doing. We are now working about monitoring and tracking of the access of the investment that we can do. How we can attack. It's a big challenge. We are working on that. I mean, if you think that for certain definition, for access, you don't have a common definition of access. There is no definition of access, energy access, if you look at it. So it's difficult then to make the numbers right, but we have to, because this is what we have to. You have to. What are the challenges ahead. We have to work with. So it's a long work together with our partners, with the partner council, with the involvement of all the actors that they're on the ground, at policy level, at global level. Sustainable energy for all has had a lot of that, for instance, in energy. But it's a constraint. Despite that, we are moving ahead, and we try to find the right answer.
Yes. Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Hello, Elizabeth from the Committee of the Regions. Sorry for my work voice, I have a big cold. Just a short question. For some countries where there's already big conflicts, for example, in some parts of Mali, northern Nigeria, and especially Sudan, South Sudan, how is the approach there? How can you, because water is also often the root of the conflicts there. It's really difficult to get there because there's no infrastructure whatsoever. How do you work there? So, Red Cross or you?
Like a Remy, do you want to go with that?
Yeah. Well, as good as we can, and as the situation allows. The Red Cross, the structure that we have, we always work with volunteers who live and work in the communities that we're also active in. So we always can rely on that basis. But if situation is too bad also for them, then of course it's difficult to work with them. But we do currently in South Sudan is maybe not so much work in communities, but with governments, regional and national governments, to see if we indeed can work on improved policies, legislation, even budgets available that will help us in our work. So maybe not so much the community work, but more at a national level. And I remember when we did introduce this program a couple of years ago in South Sudan, and I talked with the head of the International Committee of the ICRC, of the Red Cross, the ICRC there. He said that in full-blown conflict, that is of course difficult to implement such a program. But as soon as the situation stabilizes, that would be the first kind of program he would introduce that, because it very much helps to mitigate tensions and give prospect to people. So in that sense, it can also help in the conflict rather than be stopped by conflict.
If I may add on that, I think we have an obligation as development operators not to let them aside. We need to try to work with them. I make an example. We are working in Nigeria on a rural electrification program in a Boko Haram affected area. And we are trying to see with all the different parties what we can do. Then, as Remy said, then if you cannot get there, so you try to work with the local communities. There are places where we will not be able to go. I mean, that's a fact. But we have to try. We have this obligation. Try, because, as I said earlier, it's easy to work where the low-hanging fruits are, but we need this where the real problem is within this area, and we have to really make an effort. Then, if we are not able to do that, then we have to wait. We have to work in other means until the situation stabilizes, and then we go there. But it's not that. I mean, we cannot ignore the problem. We have to be ready to do as much as we can to support this area.
Eugenio, do you have anything to add? Migration is obviously a coping strategy for people in conflicts. But
yes, as I was also mentioning before, I can also add that in some of the area you mentioned, Nigeria is one, and the Boko Haram area is one, South Sudan too. One of the activities we carry out is what we call community stabilization, which is working with the community and with the community leaders and whatever actors you have in the community to try to identify their needs and try to work with them in order to satisfy those needs, and by doing so increase social cohesion of a given community of a given area. We are also doing that in the southern Libya right now, for example. So it's not necessarily specifically directed at tackling some of those environmental issues we are discussing, but of course, depending on the community and the area where we are doing this community stabilization, it can, of course, include working on this type of issue if that is one of the priorities that the community might have. So again, as both of the two other speakers have just said, we are limited to some extent by certain security or other type of situation, because there might be condition or moment where you cannot reach certain area, and that we just have to accept it and try to overcome, or simply wait that situation can be overcome. but anywhere else where there is even a slight possibility of being present, we try to be present, because through presence of the international community, working with the local community, you can gradually bring about some solution and help stabilize the situation. That's the whole objective of some of these programs.
Jane, I mean, wetlands traditionally have been where people go in times of conflict, but increasingly they seem to be, because of their degradation, the starting points of conflict. Can you see a kind of way out of that?
But I think, as Raymond said, what we have seen is that by enabling communities to, for example, restore part of the floodplain area by reconnecting it to the river, creating a larger area for production, that has actually alleviated some conflicts, for example, between those who cultivate and those who bring their animals to graze after the cultivation. So we very much see the opportunity to have ecosystem restoration in these crucial areas as a way to bring some level of social cohesion, as it was, between communities who have, for centuries, got on side by side with their different ways of living. So yeah, the shrinkage of the floodplains is a source of conflict, but you can reverse that. Restoring it is actually showing some alleviation.
Conflict as opportunity, I quite like that. Any other questions? We're close to out of time, but yes, please.
Well, it's Saiger also from Wetlands International. Yes, switched on? Yes. So just for the question of restoration of ecosystems, do you think we need a new investment model for this restoration? Because quite often restoration of ecosystems provides considerable cost savings. Quite often, classically with wetlands, you would have reduced water treatment costs, but in the case of migration, you would have reduced costs for countries when they're arriving in, and for some human costs. But we have investment during conflict zones for social cohesion. In times of disease, you might have vaccination programs, which don't necessarily provide a return on investment, but they're crucial for reducing environmental and human costs. But do you think we have the necessary financing mechanisms to deal with specifically environmental restoration, or do these still need to be developed further?
I feel like you got that.
The answer, I think we have to adapt our investment mechanisms. When the situation. When I say dimension, we need to have involvement to tackle our development in the challenges that we need to have a diversification of that investment. We mentioned now a lot when working with the private sector. This is fine, but there are situations where you have to do things in a complete, open way of, let's say, pure development aid and support. And this is something that you have to adapt your the mechanism that you use to provide financial support according to the situation that you have. I think you cannot go beyond a certain point to attract, certain type of investors, or use certain mechanisms in a situation where you have a conflict or so. We will never get there. So either you get stuck or you try to be, advancing on the traditional way of doing cooperation.
Anybody else on the new investment model, or the need for a new investment model? No? Okay, that's gone quiet. Anything? We probably ought to wind up. If anybody else has got a burning question. No, I think we're done. I'm not really going to, I think, try and sum up, but I'll just come up with a few words, I think. Resilience obviously came up a lot. Ecological resilience, but also social resilience, so the way that those in successful development projects can be made to work together, and you need to work together. And that needs to be done at the kind of landscape level, whether we're talking about river basins or wetlands or ecosystems or whatever. A lot of talk also about breaking down the barriers between silos. We clearly have a very big problem with that. Resilience doesn't fit necessarily into any ministerial portfolio. So how do you build resilience when you're trying to go from agricultural to migration policy, to environmental policy, to energy policy? Somebody managing the rivers, somebody in charge of the ecosystem, somebody in charge of biodiversity. How do you put all those together? So resilience and breaking down silos. Seems to be wetlands are at the heart of this in quite a big way because they really do cross boundaries. Things land up in wetlands. Wetlands are where the rivers kind of very often come to a halt, or at any rate, sort of stick around for a while. So the human barriers and the ecological, all this kind of gets messed up in wetlands. So they're a problem, but they're also an opportunity, because if we're going to break down the barriers, if we're going to be serious about resilience to climate change or social problems and so on, maybe wetlands are where we'll kind of work out some of those answers. From what I hear today with projects such as Partners for Resilience, there's some progress being made. So I'll stop on that vaguely optimistic note. Thank you for coming.